Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History by Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Dale C. Allison Jr. And today's discussion is based on his new book titled Interpreting Jesus. I'll link to purchase the book in the description below and in the pinned comment. And that being said, Dale, thank you very much for joining me today.
Happy to be here this evening.
And thank you for joining me. So let's do a little recap for those that missed your prior appearance on the channel. Can you tell people a little bit about your new book?
Well, it's like most of my other books on Jesus. It's a sort of collection of essays, really. There's no single theme that runs through the book, although there is, I suppose, a common method that underlies the various chapters. The first chapter has to do with what I call contingent eschatology and raises the issue of whether Jesus at some point thought there might be some sort of delay in the eschatological proceedings, and my tentative answer is yes. The second chapter is on Jesus and Moses traditions, which is something I've been interested in for a very long time now. And I suppose the gist of that chapter is that Jesus thought that he was the prophet like Moses of Deuteronomy, which is not a common opinion among New Testament scholars. The third chapter is an attempt to carve out a space between skeptics of miracles and traditional Christian apologists of miracles. I think that there is a third way of approaching these very strange stories and purported abilities. The fourth chapter is on Jesus and women, and there I'm engaged primarily with A.J. Levine and her interesting argument against the dominant view that Jesus walked around the countryside and overnighted with women. I have a slightly different view than she does. I think that was the case, and then I look at several texts in the Gospels and suggest that they should be thought about with this social context in mind. The fifth chapter is on the question of eyewitnesses and the Gospels, and this is, I suppose, the most skeptical chapter in the book. It's simply an attempt to show that thinking about eyewitnesses doesn't get us very far and doesn't help us very much with trying to evaluate what sorts of sources for the historical Jesus the Gospels might be. And then the final chapter outlines my own approach or method, which I call recurrent attestation, as opposed to multiple attestation. And there, my primary discussion partner is John Meyer, and his, I guess, 5-volume work on a marginal Jew, and I have a very different approach that he does. So that's a brief rundown on the major topics, I guess.
So what are the difficulties with attempting to know anything about the historical Jesus? What are the challenges that historians have to go through when trying to figure that out?
Well, I suppose there are multiple things. One is that we don't have anything from Jesus himself. We don't have a journal or a text. So everything is at second hand at best, probably third, fourth, or fifth hand. The second thing, of course, is that the sources are not contemporary. They are later. They don't come from the time of Jesus or the year after Jesus departed. They come from 3 or 4 decades afterwards. And the third problem, of course, is that all the sources have agendas. And maybe that's true about all sources. But when you're doing history, it's really nice to have more than one point of view or one side. And all the sources that we have for Jesus, or at least I think all the significant sources, are partisan. They have a particular point of view, and that makes this very difficult. Although I should add here, I think I'm fairly optimistic as compared with lots of other people, although more conservative people think I'm way too skeptical. So I think I'm in the happy middle.
Can you tell us a little bit about the idea of a clairvoyant Jesus?
Well, look, the sources, all of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, present Jesus as reading other people's mind. And the weird sort of thing, the weird fact is that I didn't even notice this for years. And I didn't think of it as a subject. It's not a subject within the guild. But at some point, I put all these together and realized there are like 24 texts where Jesus knows what's going on elsewhere, or where he's telepathic and knows what other people are thinking. It turns out that this is a motif in the sources. Now, traditional Christian theologians have thought, well, Jesus was divine, he was God, God knows everything. That's why Jesus knows all this stuff. Skeptics have looked at this and just said, well, there is no such thing as clairvoyance. People can't read thoughts. People don't know what's going on outside the purview of their physical senses. So these are just late legendary materials, the sort of thing that you enhance your hero with. My argument in this book is, in this chapter, is not to say I can show you that Jesus was clairvoyant. I can't at all. It's simply to say, what happens if you're somebody like me who, apart from all theology, apart from God, apart from religious ideas, thinks that this is actually a real phenomenon, and who thinks it's fairly common. Now, you can dispute this, you can disagree with this, you can think I'm naive, but that's not my point. My point is, what if you are convinced, as I am, that this is a genuine human ability, and that there are some people to whom it seems to happen more often than to others? If you think that's the case, then you can raise the possibility that Jesus exhibited this from time to time and it impressed some of the people who knew them. So my argument here is actually the opposite of David Hume. David Hume says, look around the world. We don't see any miracles. We don't see anything really, really, really strange that we don't understand. Therefore, nothing really strange happened in the first century either. I just think the world is very different than Hume thought. I agree with him. We have to think through analogy, and what's possible now was possible then. What's impossible now was impossible then. It's just that when I look around the world, I think clairvoyance is a fact, and I think there are certain individuals who seem to have a knack for this, or at least they have several stories from their lives. So I'm saying yes, since I think this is possible now, it's possible back then. I don't know how to go beyond that. I am impressed by the fact that the sources, all of them, have these strange notices that Jesus, knew what was going on or could read other people's minds. So I'm just saying, if you think, again, this has nothing to do with theology. People aren't going to get this. They always associate so-called miracles with God. I think there are all sorts of things that have been associated with miracles in the past that have nothing to do with divine intervention, that are just weird events or latent human abilities that show up once in a while. This is all has nothing to do with theology. I'm just saying, okay, if you think on empirical grounds that this happens, then it's very interesting that we have these sources agreed on this. So maybe we should think about this. That's all I'm doing there. I do the same thing with prophecy, because Jesus in the Gospels knows all sorts of things, and I think I've seen the future on 2 occasions. Everybody around me in my immediate family thinks the same thing has happened to them. Again, I don't think this is that uncommon if we get people to be honest with themselves and talk about things. So if Jesus foresaw 2 or 3 things, the tradition might run with this. Of course, there's, again, a skeptical response. You could say maybe he got lucky with a couple of hits, and then you ignore the misses and you build a picture like that. I'm perfectly aware of this, but I'm trying to think outside the box in this chapter.
Can you tell us a little bit about the intrafamilial conflict?
Well, maybe, I don't know if you're talking about Jesus's conflict with his own family, which is there.
I'm talking about that, and also what he says about people, family members turning on each other, brother,
So
sister,
I think this is fairly simple and easy to understand. Jesus, it appears, called some people, not everybody, not most people, but a small group of people to follow him from place to place. And that's meant being away from their families for a period of time. How long, I don't know. Maybe they were away and went back and so on. But it looks like some of them left their professions. So you could just imagine if you think Mark 1 has some history in it, what happens when James and John leave their boat and say to Dad, goodbye, I think we're done with this, we're going to go do something else. Well, the family wouldn't be happy with this. It might be a financial problem, among other things. So if you're calling people away from their everyday lives, the people they interact with in those everyday lives may be offended, they may be disturbed, they may be angry. And I think the synoptics show this at several points. For example, in Matthew 10, Jesus comes to set father against son and daughter against mother, and so on. And there are call stories where this appears. For example, in Luke 9, there is somebody Jesus calls, come follow me. And, I need to go and say goodbye to mom and dad first. Jesus says, no. So, or I've got to go bury somebody. So that's the setting for that. I think Jesus thought he was a prophet. And I believe he thought that his demands or his call on this little group trumped normal commitments.
So now I want to ask you about the apocalyptic Jesus. Was Jesus very apocalyptic? Did he think that there was going? What did he think about the end? What were his thoughts on all of that?
So, of course, that's a central question in New Testament scholarship, has been since the end of the 19th century. My own view is well known among scholars. I am somebody who thinks that Johannes Weiss and Albert Schweitzer are on the right track here, that most of the work of Joachim Jeremias is on the right track. So I think Jesus thought that the end was near. And by end, I mean a remade world. The details aren't there, but I assume that he thought along the lines of some of the Jewish apocalypses or some of the prophetic literature in the Hebrew Bible, such as the last chapters in Isaiah. So he looks forward to something radical, which has not come now, and I don't think can be equated with the church. He associates this new world with the resurrection of the dead and the last judgment. And he also believes that before this event takes place, there will be a period of tribulation or distress. In my view, he identifies his own time already with this period of distress. And by the way, good luck finding Jewish texts which talk about the good days to come without presenting first the horrible days to come. It's always darkest before the dawn. People go through hell before they get to heaven. That's just the pattern of Jewish messianism and Jewish apocalyptic and Jewish prophecy. You have catastrophe and then you have redemption. So Jesus lives in that sort of world with those sorts of expectations in my mind. The only thing I think I'd add to this sort of general picture is that I believe that he paid attention to Daniel 7 and read himself and his followers into Daniel 7. And that's the origin of at least some of the Son of Man language in the Gospels.
So now I'd like to ask you about Mary Magdalene. Some link Magdalene, and they say that it's linked to Magdala and that's kind of stuff. So what do you make of all of that?
Well, so there's been an interesting discussion recently, and I haven't done anything except read some articles on this, and I haven't spent my own time trying to figure out whether Magdalene comes from a village, or whether it means something like pillar. It's a nickname. I don't know. I do think it's very interesting that she shows up in the Gospels, but she's not a figure in Acts. She's not a big figure in the Pauline epistles. She isn't a figure elsewhere until we get to some later apocryphal stuff. My own guess is that she was a historical person, that she was an interesting character and companion of the historical Jesus, and that she may very well have been the first one to see him, to encounter the risen Jesus. And if she followed him around, and if she had heard his teachings, I think it's quite possible that she was the first, whatever you want to call them. Maybe, I mean, a lot of people don't like the word Christian these days. I don't know what the substitute is, but maybe she was the first person to say God raised Jesus from the dead. If she has listened to him, and if he has been talking about the eschatology, the latter things, if the resurrection is to come, and she has an encounter, sensible encounter with him, then she might be the first one to say, oh, yeah, the resurrection of the dead has started. The end has begun, and so on. Maybe she's the first.
What do you make of the Christian tradition of John Mark and his connection to Peter, and the idea that he offered the Gospel of Mark?
So I do have a chapter where I discuss, I guess, this at some length. And so I'm not a defender of the tradition, but I also have no assurance that it's false. So what I do in this book is I say, well, let's just assume for the sake of argument that it's true, then what follows? My own view is that not a lot follows. Unlike some people who would say, well, Mark listened to Peter, and so since Peter's an eyewitness, Mark is reliable, and so on. Even if you accept the tradition, which goes back to Papias, even if you accept that tradition, you don't know how much of Mark would be from Peter, even if Mark knew Peter. How much? It's very interesting if you look at Peter, people who have accepted this tradition, Vincent Taylor and others more recently. They don't tell you that all of Mark is from Peter. They say, well, some of it is. How much? We don't know. So I'm an agnostic about this tradition. I think this is the case that two of the modern scholars who have spent a lot of time studying this tradition, Joel Marcus and Clifton Black, are also agnostic about it. So they both say it could be true, but they don't know how to show it's true or to make it more probable than not. So it's just for them a really intriguing possibility. That's what it is for me. I see nothing in the text to disprove this tradition, and I've always thought that if you were just going to make up something from scratch, you would just say Peter wrote this. You would call it the Gospel according to Peter, as somebody does in the second century with what we know as the Gospel according to Peter. So there's probably somebody named Mark there, and there is, of course, a Mark, in New Testament sources, in First Peter and in Acts and in Paul, and so maybe they're connected, but I don't know how to establish or prove this. I'm sorry, you can't prove much of anything. to make this probable, more probable than not, to my satisfaction.
So now I want to shift to the Q document. What do you make of Q currently? Some will say that this is a hypothetical document. I mean, obviously it is a hypothetical document, but how much stock can one put into this hypothetical document to know anything about the historical Jesus?
All right. So in my work on the historical Jesus, I don't think anything hinges upon Q. Maybe I'd have to think about this, but I'm not like the older scholars. There were a few of them who would say our earliest sources are Q and Mark, so let's focus on them, and that will give us what we want. I do think, despite very smart people arguing to the contrary, that the Q hypothesis still makes more sense than the alternatives. I am really confident, against, again, some really smart people. I'm really confident that Luke is not using Mark. If Luke or Mark are related directly, I think it's more likely Matthew used Luke, so-called theory of Matthean posterior, whatever it is. Anyway, Matthew being after Luke. But I don't think this has a lot of value for historical Jesus studies. I still think that the traditions from the first century are just to be thrown out in front of us, and we try to make sense of them. And if something's in Q, it could be secondary. If something's only in Matthew, it could be primary. I think, for example, that Matthew used Mark, and that Mark is the earlier text. But I think Matthew is closer to Jesus's own understanding of Torah than Mark is. I think Mark has been influenced by Paul, or at least belongs to something like the Pauline wing of the church. He thinks the law is gone. Matthew does not think that. I think Matthew there is closer to Jesus, even though Matthew is the later gospel using Mark. There may even be some historical stuff in John. I think there probably is, even though John's later, and even though I think John knows 2 or 3 of the synoptics. So for me, we just look at the traditions that we have that are the earliest. And my own judgment is that those traditions happen to be in the canonical Gospels and in Paul. I don't think the Gospel of Thomas is early, although I think parts of it maybe, because I think it was a rolling text and that things were added to it as it went along. April DeConnick's theory about that makes sense to me. But I can't just take the Gospel of Thomas and say this is a first century text. I think most of it is second century.
Can you expand more on the connection between Paul and the Gospel of Mark?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion of this since an article was written, I think in the late 90s, by Joel Marcus. And what he argued is that Mark's gospel makes really good sense as a sort of narrative version of Paul's kerygma. If you look at Paul is all about the death and about the resurrection of Jesus. That's what he proclaims. That's his so-called kerygma. And the Gospel of Mark is arranged accordingly. That is, its culmination is the Passion, and leading up to the Passion, you have the prophecies of death and resurrection. So you have Jesus himself, in effect, composing the kerygma, so that Mark, on the whole, fits with that central Pauline theme. But there are other places that that you see what I would say is a closer connection. So again, Mark on the law sounds to me close to Paul on the law. And in fact, if you look at Romans 14 and Mark 7, I think Mark's claim that Jesus declared all foods clean sounds very much like Paul in Romans 14. So that's a place where I think we've crossed the line, the 50-50 line. I think it's more probable that Mark has been influenced by Paul. And by the way, if, again, I said I'm agnostic about this, but if the author of Mark is the traditional author, then he's associated with Paul and Acts and the epistles. So that shouldn't be a surprise for a traditional evaluation of the authorship of Mark.
So now I'd like to ask you about the Gospel of John. Which kind of material in the Gospel of John do you think reflects the historical Jesus, or possibly reflects the historical Jesus?
Well, possibly. So the interesting note that Jesus baptized, which is immediately followed by, well, he really didn't, but his disciples did, which sounds like somebody's correcting the tradition there. That's really interesting to me. I don't know why John or the tradition would invent this. This is a possibility. Some people have thought that the trial, or so-called trial before the Jewish leaders in Mark, makes more sense in John, where it seems like it's just an informal hearing. And there are several references to places in John, that like the Kidron Valley, which aren't in the Synoptics, which seem to show somewhere in the tradition somebody is remembering places, the topography of Jerusalem. Nobody outside of Jerusalem knows what the Kidron Valley is. That just has to come from somebody who had been there or talked to somebody who had been there. So there are these things in John like that. On the other hand, I'm old-fashioned with regard to John. I'm not on board with Paul Anderson's bioptic approach, where we have the Synoptics and John and their interfluentiality. I think John is a secondary source. I think it knows Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I think it's correcting them, rewriting them at points. However, Matthew is rewriting Mark, and he still has lots of non-Markan tradition. And Luke is rewriting Mark and still has lots of non-Markan tradition. I think John knows Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but he still has stories about Jesus. I think there were lots of stories and tales out there, and John hasn't, in effect, just made up everything that is not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But it, of course, is very hard to tell what might be historical and what might not be. I also am one who toys with the idea that John may have the temple episode in the right place. The usual idea is that it belongs to the last week of Jesus's life, which is where Matthew, Mark, and Luke put it. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke only have a one-year ministry. John's longer ministry makes some sense to me. And if Mark is condensing everything to 1 year, he has no choice but to put that incident at the end. So yeah, it's possible John's right about that. I don't know, but again, I've toyed with the idea, and I find it really interesting. And it accords with my suspicion that the public ministry of Jesus probably was more than 1 year, and John is correct there, if that's the case, and the Synoptics don't have that.
If John's longer ministry of Jesus is more historical, why did Mark crib it down to a year?
Oh, I have no idea. That's like asking me why Mark doesn't have more sayings of Jesus, because he must have known more sayings of Jesus. I have no idea. Just got to be honest with you.
I guess what I'm really asking is, what's your What would be your best guess? Like,
Oh,
yeah.
so some things I have guesses about, and other things I just don't. I have no idea. I don't know whether that is a literary thing, whether Mark just received this from the tradition and knew nothing about a longer ministry. I just wouldn't have any idea how to go about judging that.
So now I want to go back to Q. What do you make of the Mark Q overlaps? Is this evidence that Mark either knew Q or did it know a common source or tradition that's connected to it?
Yeah, so the standard answer, and the one I held for many, many, many years, is that Mark is here and Q is here, and they don't overlap at all. There are a handful of people who have argued that maybe Mark does know Q, and that these Mark and Q overlaps reflect that fact. This becomes a very detailed and difficult, complex discussion. When I wrote a commentary on Matthew, I did not find sufficient reason to think that Mark and Q were anything other than independent sources. But in the last 10 years or so, I've been rethinking this, and I think in this book, I have a section arguing that maybe those who have argued for a Mark Q overlap are correct. I just said may because that's all I can come up with. I know that's frustrating, but when you're doing history, especially history of the first century, lots of things that you'd like to know that you're never going to know. So I used to think no, now I think, well, maybe.
How do you look at John the Baptist in comparison to Jesus? Did Jesus inherit a lot of what he thinks from John the Baptist, or are Jesus' teachings largely different from that of John the Baptist?
Well, so here again, I would want to stress our ignorance. So if you look at the number of sentences in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John attributed to the Baptist, it's very, very few, just a handful of sentences, a handful of assertions. Not only that, but these are the sentences that early Christians thought would be helpful for their presentation of Jesus. So you have no reason to think that somebody's sitting there and saying, oh, let's get a sort of objective, fair analysis of the gist of everything that John the Baptist was about. You rather get a focus on eschatology, I think in large part because Jesus was an eschatological figure. So if you only have a few sentences about this guy, what do you know about him? So Jesus, it appears, spoke in parables to John the Baptist. Well, we have no parables from John the Baptist. But if John the Baptist used parables, would we know about it? No, we just wouldn't know about it. Did he talk about the kingdom of God? Matthew can have him do that. Did he? Well, maybe he did, and maybe Jesus got that from him. There are some interesting links between the few things we have about the Baptist and some of the sayings attributed to Jesus, like Luke 13 and the axe at the root of the tree, which lines up very nicely with the saying attributed to John the Baptist. Maybe that those two texts are somehow related to each other. I think that probably Jesus's debt to John was greater than the sources as we now have them indicate. But that's what you would expect. The sources are about Jesus. Jesus must increase, John must decrease, right? So maybe Jesus spent a lot of time with John, and maybe he got some ideas from him. Who knows? Maybe he got the idea of using parables from John the Baptist. We just don't know, but you have to be careful of what New Testament scholars are always doing, which is taking the little that we have about John the Baptist and then making this big contrast with what Jesus was all about. I hesitate to do that because we have so little about John the Baptist, and it's not filled out at all. So I guess the answer to your question is probably a lot of influence, but we know less about John the Baptist, I believe, than most New Testament scholars think.
Do you find the apocalyptic content in Q to be similar to Mark's apocalyptic material, or would you say it's a bit different?
No, I've never been one for stressing differences between Mark and apocalyptic and Q apocalyptic. Of course, you have a problem here because we're all using this word apocalyptic as though we know what it means, that we all agree on it, and we certainly don't. When I use apocalyptic of Jesus in my books, I always have a footnote explaining exactly what I mean, and I'm always talking about apocalyptic eschatology, and it relates to some large themes that has nothing to do with beasts and numerology and things that you can find in some of the apocalypses. And if you're looking at the larger eschatological themes, then I see I don't see anything much different between Mark's eschatological expectations and Q's eschatological expectations. They both look forward to the resurrection of the dead. They both look forward to the Son of Man, and they both look forward to judgment, and so on.
How does Jesus compare to Elijah and Moses?
Well, there's a whole chapter on this in the book, and the main idea is that Jesus consciously sought to emulate Moses. So this is why in Luke he casts out demons by the finger of God, because that is the instrument through which Moses did his miracles. And he institutes a covenant through blood, the blood of the covenant in Mark, because that's what Moses did. He has 12 disciples. He picks 12 people to follow him around and to assist, to extend his ministry and so on. And Moses is the guy in the Hebrew Bible who picks 12 people to assist him in his work. So if you go through, you can find, go through the Gospels, that there are all sorts of places where Jesus sounds like Moses or acts like Moses. He feeds a crowd in the desert. Maybe Jesus consciously tried to do something to emulate Moses, like some of the sign prophets that we read about in Josephus. Now, I think that within a Jewish context, that would take you back, since Jesus is a prophet, since he's an eschatological figure, it would take you back to Deuteronomy 18, which in the Dead Sea Scrolls is understood as an eschatological oracle. In the latter days, there will be a prophet like Moses, which is also in the rabbis, although it often gets conflated with the Messiah, which is a conflation also already in the New Testament. Now, as far as Elijah goes, this is really interesting because John Meyer thinks that the primary figure for comparison with Jesus is Elijah. And there are some parallels, but here's the interesting thing. In Jewish tradition, Elijah is an imitator of Moses. For example, Elijah in Kings, 1 Kings 19, he fasts for 40 days, and then he goes up on Mount Sinai, and there's a cave there, just like the cave that's back there in Exodus 33. And there's a theophany on the mountain, just as there's a theophany back there. So there are lots of parallels between the accounts of Elijah and the accounts of Moses. There's a famous rabbinic text which just goes on and on for several pages, compiling these parallels. Modern commentators will look at some of these and say, yeah, this is a literary phenomenon. A handful of people have said, well, maybe Elijah, the historic Elijah, knew about Moses and was seeking to imitate him. That's irrelevant for my purposes. It's just to say that Elijah is not a non-Mosaic or un-Mosaic figure. That is, in Jewish tradition, they are very much like one another. So that if in the gospel tradition, Jesus is sometimes like Elijah, that doesn't speak anything against him being like Moses, just as there are also a few places where Jesus is like Elisha. But in Jewish tradition, Elisha is very much an imitator of Elijah. So to be like Elijah is to be like Elisha, to be like Elisha is to be like Elijah, and Jesus is like both, just as he's also like Moses. However, having said that, I think if you want to bet, the best bet is to follow the Synoptic tradition and to think that at some point Jesus himself said, oh, okay, John's filling the role of Elijah, and I'm the Mosaic like prophet. Although again, John the Baptist disappears from the scene, so maybe Jesus thought that he had to take up that side of things too. Anyway, I don't like any of these neat distinctions that people sometimes have. There's a prophet like Moses, and then there's the Messiah, and Elijah over here. All these things can merge and coalesce and be very blurry. Historical actors often don't walk around thinking logically like Immanuel Kant. And Jesus is a prophet, and he's full of rhetoric, and I don't see any reason to get real precise about Christological themes, motifs, ideas, roles, and so on. Things were probably a part of blur to him.
Do you think that the historical Jesus fought himself to be the Messiah and or the Son of God?
Well, I think the first is the place to start, and yeah, I think so. I don't know what would have led to that conviction in the post-Easter period. I think it's easiest to think that it comes from the time before Easter, and so that Easter, whatever it was, confirms what the disciples already hoped, that Jesus would be the Messiah. But I think Jesus was probably a bit like Rabbi Schneerson, like the Rebbe, in the last part of the 20th century, and was cagey about this, probably thought that only God can reveal the Messiah. It's not his place to act like the Messiah, because actually he can't give himself a throne in Jerusalem. If he's going to be the Messiah, it's got to be something that God is going to do for him. So it makes no sense to say I am the Messiah. What he must be, if there's a messianic consciousness, is a Messiah in waiting, or a Messiah hoping to be anointed, something like that. Now, the Son of God language, I think originally probably comes out of Davidic traditions. It probably has its roots back in 2 Samuel 14, where you have this prophecy, which is about Samuel, and he is going to be the one who builds the temple, right? And he will be God's son. Now, in Judaism, this oracle, even though it was about Solomon, had to be understood as partially unfulfilled, because Solomon's kingdom didn't last forever, as the oracle says. So it has to be about a Davidic Messiah or an anointed one down the line. So I think Son of God language originally comes from Davidic messianism. That's probably how it enters the Jesus tradition, what role it plays in Jesus's own thought. I don't know that I've ever written on it because I've never quite been able to figure out how to make an argument from what little we have in the Synoptics. But I am confident that originally the Son of God language comes out of Messiah language, and then of course gets all sorts of additional connotations with time.
Is there any traces of historical data in the special M and special L material?
Well, yeah. So I think probably some of the parables in Luke do. As I've told you before this evening, I think this is not a particular saying. I wouldn't want to argue that. But I think the attitude towards Torah in Matthew is probably correct. Again, Matthew has some parables that may go back to Jesus, but you also have to remember that what I'm doing these days is not what it doesn't allow me, let's put it this way, to answer your question in a straightforward fashion, because I'm very skeptical of my own ability to go through the tradition and to say, Jesus said this, Jesus did not say that, this happened, this didn't happen. There are some things I'm pretty sure didn't happen, and there are some things I'm pretty sure did happen. There are some things I think Jesus didn't say, some things he did say, but the majority of the tradition, certainly over 50%, I don't know how to show that it goes back to Jesus or doesn't go back to Jesus. And that's why my own method in the last few years has been to go through M, Q, Mark, L, and John, and the Gospel of Thomas when relevant, and look for repeating patterns and themes, and then see what I can do with those without having to do what John Meyer did, which was, this parable isn't authentic, this one I can show isn't a composition of Jesus, and so on. I don't know how to do that. I don't have the confidence that Meyer had. I also differ from Meyer because when Meyer would say, okay, I can show these parables weren't uttered by Jesus, and these were, but I can't do anything with, these 25 parables. Since I can't prove that they're authentic or inauthentic, I'll just disregard them. I don't do that. Again, I'm looking at all of them and seeing if there are repeating patterns or themes, and then asking whether that repeating pattern or theme could tell us something about Jesus, or whether it's purely secondary development. So I'm not going through and saying, I can show this parable in M comes from Jesus, or this parable in Luke does, although I would be surprised if some of them do not.
And for my final question, can you tell us who Maximus the Hut Burner is, and does he compare to Jesus?
Well, so one of the things I do in this book is make a claim that some metanormal events happen. The world is a very strange place, and so maybe some of the strange things associated with Jesus could happen. However, I also have a little excursus, and it's on stories from eyewitnesses that pass my boggle threshold. That is, these are stories which I find really hard to take literally, but they are from eyewitnesses. So Maximus the Hut Burner was a fellow that lived on Mount Athos hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and he wanted to be a solitary. So when too many people found out where he was, he would burn his hut and then go to some other part of the island so he could be by himself. Now, there are two biographies from people who knew Maximus the hut burner, and they both recount the story of him flying, not just levitating a few inches off the ground, but flying, zooming through the air, flying above the trees. And, my worldview is strange. So maybe, but I can't say that I believe it. Maybe it's possible, but I don't believe it. But what's so interesting here is we have firsthand eyewitness accounts of this. And one of the writers actually twice says he swears by God that he really saw this happening. My point here is that there are things from eyewitnesses that pass the boggle threshold of almost everybody. And you can't just say, well, the stories in the Gospels go back to eyewitnesses, therefore we can trust them, including the miracles, because you have lots of eyewitness testimony to lots of miracles that very few people would take seriously. So that's my comparative point there. Despite my open-mindedness, I catalog a bunch of things that I find really hard to believe, even though they are coming from serious people who claim to be eyewitnesses.
And just to remind everyone, the link to Interpreting Jesus will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. With that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Dale Allison.
Thank you. Happy for your questions.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.